The word abstraction is used all over the place in discussions about wargaming, often in reference to quite a number of different aspects of rule design and hobbying. In today's video, I'll be unpicking the term in a wide range of different contexts, from its relevance to the work of influential military theorists in their attempts to analyse and model the ebb and flow of combat, to more familiar problems in game design, like mechanics for movement and command. So, what are some of those uses to which wargamers have put the term, and why is Mini Agnostic launching into another pedantic diatribe about terminology? Well, on a good day, you may encounter some quite detailed discussions about levels of abstraction in reference to the ways in which different games model the complex unfolding of events related to something like logistics. Better yet, you may even find discussions about the consistency with which different decisions and processes are omitted or abstracted to varying degrees within a rule set, according to the scale of conflict and the level of command the game's intending to represent. More commonly, it's just used to describe any way in which an action is simplified and represented in a game. Occasionally, this will be expanded further still to include things like the number of miniatures on a base, the height of the figures in relation to pieces of terrain, the representation of different individuals within a unit, and so on. In this broader sense, abstraction can seem to mean essentially just the use of miniatures. And then, unfortunately, one encounters some rather more confused and problematic uses of the term, as either a slight towards certain rule sets, as though its quote-unquote level of abstraction was simply a measure of the game designer's laziness and or desire for accessibility in a system, or, more frustratingly still, as a monolithic concept governing every aspect of the hobby, to the extent that any and every discussion of realism, verisimilitude, or, heaven forfend, historical accuracy is dismissed as being contrary to the very nature of wargaming. By mentioning this, I don't mean to suggest for a moment that abstraction doesn't exist everywhere in the hobby. Of course it does. But instead, the problem arises when abstraction is viewed as a simple on-off switch, where something is either abstracted or granular, the implication being that whereas granularity is realistic, abstraction is not. Now, everyone will, of course, have their own preference with rule sets, and I'll be making no attempt in this video to dictate how anyone should enjoy their hobby. Instead, I've simply become a bit obsessed with some of the questions that surround abstraction in wargaming, from a philosophical and military theoretical perspective, in the hope of prompting some slightly more critical discussions about its use in the hobby. So, to begin, at its root, abstraction is the challenge of deriving, from all the messy detail and specificity of concrete, real-world situations, a set of generalizable principles that hold together in an abstract, non-physical sense. This might seem to be aligned more with the use of the term in philosophy than in wargaming, but there's a common theme here, in the stripping away of superfluous detail to view or represent only the essence of something. Think, as a quick example, of some common movement mechanics in games. As a rules designer, you might decide that adverse terrain of many different sorts will affect movement across all unit types by some common factor, like half movement, or at a more granular level, you could assign an agility stat to each type of unit within a dice check, featuring different modifiers depending on the exact type of terrain being clambered over. Both, in different ways, are abstractions of the actual biomechanics of negotiating an obstacle, since each represents the difficulty of doing so, with an end result being that movement is slowed. So I'll start at a pretty fundamental level, with problems facing not only wargames design, but pretty much all military theory and strategy as well. That being the question of how on earth anyone is supposed to make sense of something as chaotic as warfare in the first place. Just think of the sheer number of discrete events, decisions and variables involved. To help explain some of our options, and underline just how big of a challenge this is for rules writers, I'll turn to the work of two influential military theorists, no doubt familiar to many of my viewers with an interest in the 19th century, Jomini and Clausewitz. Being very much a thinker of the Enlightenment, the 19th century Swiss theorist Antoine-Henri Jomini, in his book The Art of War, adopted a logical, almost scientific approach in attempting to discover some rational, generalizable principles that governed warfare. Among Jomini's ideas are things like the principle of mass, in which he explains that engagements are won by the concentration of an overwhelming military force at the decisive point. Okay, so when considering rules design, we might then say that, at the highest level, a successful abstraction of conflict will be one in which the resolution of combat works in accordance with these basic principles. That is to say that, regardless of how any of the actual mechanics operate for shooting, morale and so on, our system should reward gameplay in which, through manoeuvre, the bulk of one's forces are brought to bear upon fractions of the opponent's. This represents our highest level of abstraction, and its rules should really make intuitive sense. It would, admittedly, be quite a strange rule set that routinely allows smaller, supposedly weaker units of one army to defeat larger, more powerful and better positioned portions of their opponent's force. You can imagine in some big map-based grand strategy style game that this may well be the most fitting level of abstraction, in which large formations can be positioned on individual map tiles, with each point of engagement boiling down to a simple comparison of which side has the larger unit strength. But wait, you might say, what about the impact of things like intelligence on the battlefield, lost or misinterpreted commands, the role of chance, and so on? Well, this of course brings us on to Clausewitz. In the opening chapter of his treatise, Vom Kriege, or On War, he actually takes an even further step back to contemplate the fundamental nature of war in itself, which he describes as an act of force to compel our enemy to do our will. Remaining at this intellectual level, removed from the realities of conflict, he similarly formulates various general laws concerning the interactions that take place. He begins, for instance, by remarking that one side in a conflict will inevitably gain the upper hand, to which the other must then follow suit, meaning that each thereby drives its opponent towards extremes. In purely logical terms, then, it follows that the extreme must always be the goal, and therefore that in war the greatest effort must always be exerted. This, for Clausewitz, represents war in an absolute or ideal form, a construction very much wrapped up in the Kantian notion of the thing in itself, that being the true nature or status of things as they are. Clausewitz indeed refers to this in very idealist sense as the pure concept of war. No sooner does Clausewitz lay out such pronouncements on this fundamental nature of war, however, than he begins to address the limitations of such an inflexible logic. Although in purely abstract terms there may indeed be an imperative to exert the greatest effort in war, in reality it's rarely such an isolated event, consisting of a single decisive act in which no degree of strength is too much to commit. It would, for instance, lead to strength being wasted, quote, contrary to other principles of statecraft. In the sections of Vom Kriege that represent Clausewitz's more mature thoughts on the topic, he pays great attention to the separation of war on paper from war in reality. And it's here that we come to surely Clausewitz's most influential contribution to military theory, in the concept of general friction. Broadly put, this refers to those factors during combat itself that, together, impede the execution of rational, logically derived principles of warfare. Despite several inconsistencies in how they're named and grouped together, the various examples of this can be split into 5 main categories, as suggested by Barry D. Watts in his paper Clausewitzian Friction and Future War. Those categories are danger, physical exertion, uncertainty, the confusingly named narrow friction, and chance. The first two, danger and physical exertion, are viewed largely from a psychological perspective, with regards to the inhibition of one's senses, instincts and general effectiveness under extreme distress or exhaustion. Uncertainty refers to problems in military intelligence and one's understanding of the situation on the battlefield, leading to poor decision-making, as well as undermining one's conviction or sense of resolve. Narrow friction, meanwhile, is a byproduct of the sheer number of individuals involved in warfare, plus their interactions and the equipment they use. In essence, it's the messiness of commanding people. And finally, we have chance, understood in terms of particular events of luck or misfortune, rather than the baseline level of sheer randomness implied by narrow friction. An example I'd give here, for instance, is to think of the ricochet of that cannonball that led to the death of Jean Lannes, something no one could have foreseen at the time. So, to reiterate, although a Jominian principle of warfare makes rational sense and may remain the correct choice on paper, Clausewitz, through this concept of friction, emphasises the various challenges one might encounter when attempting to execute such a plan in practice. When modelling warfare on the tabletop, then, it stands to reason that we should also find a way to abstract the effect of friction in battle. Just like our earlier example of various movement mechanics concerning difficult terrain, there are of course different degrees to which this could be resembled in a wargame. Some systems, like Black Powder, and indeed the entire family of rule sets derived from Rick Priestley's fantastic War Master system, are great at this, I think, in the way that friction is incorporated through the use of a command rating and dice under mechanic to determine the effectiveness of one's orders. This system can be viewed, for instance, as a simple abstraction of the whole chain of steps from uncertainty in the quality of one's reports on the state of the battlefield, the clarity of one's instructions, the process of relaying those orders, and the accuracy of their execution. The use of dice introduces an element of chance as well, while command ratings stand in for everything from a leader's coolness under pressure, the effectiveness of their staff system, and perhaps the interpretation of reports. The effect of danger and physical exertion, meanwhile, make an appearance through things like penalties to shooting and break tests for units that have been disordered. So, what can we take from all this? Well, first, although it's a pretty mundane point to make, nearly everything in wargaming is, of course, abstracted to some extent. Even what are deemed quite granular rule sets will still feature an absolute boatload of abstractions just to make the thing playable in the first place. Just think of the number of actions involved in something as commonplace on the battlefield as the loading and firing of a musket. Now multiply that by the number of men in a battalion. Likewise, although there are some rule sets out there that try to avoid abstraction in certain respects, most notably through the concept of true line of sight, a common problem is that even when individual miniatures are scaled correctly, the footprint of a unit is still completely out of proportion, and individual buildings might stand in for small hamlets or settlements. That is to say, then, that even when you design one mechanic in a way that attempts to avoid abstraction, you nevertheless have to consider all the other related systems with which it interacts, where abstraction is very much still in effect. Second, since abstraction is, by this argument, the norm rather than the exception in wargaming, that means that, contrary to received wisdom, I'd argue that it's not granularity that's the opposite of abstraction at all, but instead omission. Think back to our combat mechanic proposed for a map-based grand strategy style of game, where combat is reduced only to the high-level Jomini principle of mass, by comparing unit strengths, versus another rule set that attempts to abstract each of Clausewitz's elements of general friction. No matter the level of granularity with which things like psychology and uncertainty are simulated within the latter rule set, they're still present in some sense, whereas the former simply omits them altogether. Third, irrespective of how a rule set actually simulates conflict itself, our perception of how realistic a system is depends more on conventions of rules design within the hobby than it does on the extent to which it adheres to a model of war in reality instead of war on paper. Indeed, I'd even go so far as to say that the types of mechanics that one associates with a more granular rule set, like the interaction of stats for initiative, weapon skill, strength, toughness, armor save, weapon strength, plus various special rules for combat like in Warhammer Fantasy, often omit a huge number of factors associated by someone like Clausewitz with warfare in reality. Warhammer instead spends page after page devoted to mechanics that boil down to modelling the geometry of an axe swing. So, there are a couple of thoughts on the topic. If you're still listening at this point, thank you for sticking around. This video is a bit of an excursion from the more hobby-based videos on the channel that I've produced recently, but rules design and theory are things I'd mentioned all the way from the beginning as stuff I wanted to explore, so let me know what you think. It's also that time of year as a teacher where it becomes very difficult to find any time for hobbying, so I can't promise rapid progress on the painting front, but I'll try to keep plugging away at things. Enough rambling. Best of luck with all your hobbying, and until next time.